Kindly start now.
Okay, thank you, and thank you everybody for joining today, and certainly thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to present to the group of students that is online, and hopefully I can help you not only understand the topic of medical device cybersecurity or cybersecurity in general, but also you make some decisions with regards to your future career as it relates to the merging of cybersecurity and clinical engineering. Right, those used to be separate disciplines, and I think more and more they're coming together for reasons we will discuss in this presentations. So what I thought we'll talk about today is we'll start really high level and talk about trends in cybersecurity and the threat landscape overall, and then talk a little bit about cybersecurity concepts and terminology. And the first two really will only touch a little bit on medical devices. And then the third and fourth section will specifically talk about healthcare and will specifically talk about medical devices and medical device cybersecurity. So briefly about myself. By training, I'm a traditional electrical engineer, hardware engineer, and actually started working with Siemens Medical, designing power supplies. But eventually, in the course of my career, spent actually a number of years in marketing and marketing-related positions, product management, and eventually transitioned into healthcare IT, specifically the PAC side, and then from there ended up in cybersecurity in a more technical role again. So it was really, from a career perspective, not a straight line. There was a little bit of a meandering, series of jobs and changes in jobs and opportunities I took. But in the end, they all contributed, I think, to my understanding on what is medical device cybersecurity, right? Because I understood the medical device hardware side, I understood the regulatory side, I understood the health IT side, and also cybersecurity risks. And then when about 10 years ago, medical device cybersecurity became a topic in the industry, turned out I had all of the background I needed for that, and it has really become initially a part-time topic for me, but now it's a full-time job. So again, not a straight line career that led to what I do today, but certainly all the pieces were put in place to what I'm doing today, just to give you that kind of background. So talking about cybersecurity and the threat landscape in general, and really what I want to make sure here is that you understand the impact of cyber events that impacts not only on us personally, but really on our larger societies, our political systems, and our economies. And want to discuss key trends on how we actually got to where we are today in cybersecurity. And I'm sure that you have, over the last couple of years, you being in a technical role here in your studies, paid attention to some of the cyber events that happened over the last couple of years. Everything from the WannaCry malware attack on the UK National Health Service that shut down 81 hospitals and almost 600 physician practices that infected mainly IT systems, but also some medical devices like infusion pumps and MRI scanners. Then also in 2017, we had the NotPetya malware that had a lot of impact across all industries, not just healthcare. And it is estimated that it cost global industries about more than $10 billion in damages. So those are significant numbers and significant impacts. And one particular example is a global pharmaceutical manufacturer, and they reported a recovery that lasted for no more than 9 months, and they reported losses of more than $100 million because the cyber event led to drug and vaccine shortages globally and impacted their sales and cost them money in terms of recovery. Then more recently, last year, we had the so-called SolarWinds attack, which affect everything from US government agencies over cybersecurity companies. We estimate that about 18,000 organizations globally were impacted by it. And Microsoft actually assigned a team of 500 engineers to investigate this particular attack. And what is even more startling is that Microsoft estimates that the team behind the attack was probably twice the size. That's the team that developed and executed this attack. And they called it really the most sophisticated and largest cyber attack the world has ever seen. Then earlier this year, we had an attack on the Colonial Pipeline, which impacted gasoline supply and led to gasoline price spikes and shortages across the US East Coast. And then very recently, a large healthcare provider in Southern California, Scripps Healthcare, was impacted by a ransomware attack, and they are now in the 4th week of recovery from their ransomware attack. So again, those are all just individual data points, but this is to set the stage and basically get the message across on how impactful cyber events can be today, both financially, but also from an operational perspective, everything from gasoline supply to healthcare delivery. So how did we get there? Right? What happened in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years in cyberspace, and why are we facing these tremendous attacks now? Basically, we went from what were individual hackers, so-called script kiddies and people that were in it for intellectual stimulus, leading to cyber criminals, leading to nation states getting involved in cyber attacks, and then more recently, development of what is called hackers for hire, basically organizations that are highly skilled and they work for anybody who's willing to pay them to do whatever job needs to be done. So the motivation changed, right? The individual hackers were in it for the fame. They wanted to be known as a better hacker than the other guy. That changed when cyber criminals were in it for financial reasons in nation states to conduct cyber warfare attacks or even follow political goals. So the targets changed as well. Rather than targeting individual computers, it led to attacks on more complex information and theft of information, attacks on infrastructure and services, and even attacks on entire nations, societies, and economies. And then with that went a change in objectives, right? What were they actually after? The early hackers were in it for intellectual stimulus. They wanted to write malware that was better than other malware. They wanted to be known. They wanted to be famous. Once the cyber criminals started trading in the underground economy, it became a very different game. They wanted to stay anonymous. They wanted to stay stealthy. They didn't want to be discovered because they wanted to steal as much as possible. And then, of course, the political motivation, espionage, sabotage, subversion, destruction, even changed the game again. And just to substantiate this, fairly abstract discussion, so how can we demonstrate that change? Symantec, a cybersecurity company I used to work for, published every year a report on malware and how much malware was produced in a given year. And basically what they did in this not even 10-year span here is they basically said, okay, numbers are going up. They're going up exponentially. They're roughly doubling every year, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. But overall, the trend was towards doubling. What is interesting that after 2009, it even accelerated more, and really the numbers were so high that counting malware, new malware, didn't make sense anymore. And we pretty quickly arrived at rates of hundreds of millions of new pieces of malware per year, or 1 million a day. And that happened in 2014. So clearly we see that the industrialization of cybercrime led to tool-based production of malware of staggering numbers. So the attacks became highly sophisticated, well-planned, stealthy, and profit-focused. We saw what is called malware as a service, and tools that help cyber criminals to develop, test, obfuscate, distribute, and manage malware. And since 2014, we are seeing pretty much a steady state of 500,000 to 1 million new pieces of malware per day. And even more scary, cyber criminals actually use now malware like ransomware to make money, and they're reinvesting about 40% of their profits in the development of new technologies, new malware, new attacks. And clearly their ability to progress, it seems, is outpacing our ability to defend. Another example, right, the proliferation and professionalization of cybercrime. Here's a specific organization called the Drydex Gang, and they're specialized in spam email. And they are running certain spam email campaigns every day. And what is interesting is that there are certain days where there was no activity, and those days were weekends and the winter holiday break. So clearly, nothing says this is now a profession more than if the criminals take weekends and vacation off. Right? Another example is, guess what? They now offer you actually online support. So if your computer is getting encrypted with ransomware and you can't figure out how to pay the ransomware, you can actually chat with a friendly support technician who then can help you to figure out how to make your payment. Again, this is highly professionalized cybercrime. And just to round off this section, another scary and concerning trend is that I think we globally, and certainly healthcare as an industry, are underinvesting in cybersecurity. The market research firm Gartner estimates that we are right now spending about $100 billion a year in cybersecurity defenses, tools and services, and staffing and whatnot. But globally, losses are estimated to be several trillion. And if you look at different studies, some say it's 1 trillion, another one says it's 3 trillion. And frankly, it doesn't matter what the number is, it is a big number, right? That's the scary part. And also what is really scary is that our investment is growing at a few percent a year, less than 10% a year, whereas the losses seem to be growing by multiples. So clearly the losses are outpacing our investment. I'm not saying that simply investing more in cybersecurity will lead to a better cybersecurity posture. But clearly we need to change our approach, in investing in technology as part of that. Otherwise, we'll never be able to catch up, and the cyber events we are facing will become not only more costly, but eventually will also cost lives. So second section, and I'll leave maybe questions for the end here. I'll just keep going. And this is probably a little boring, but I want to make sure that you understand the language of cybersecurity, like the concepts we use in cybersecurity, so that You can correctly use that terminology in your professional life when you, as a clinical engineering professional, for example, communicate with an IT professional or cybersecurity professional that has more of an IT background in your organization. And also understand the difference between how we think about cyber risk and traditional safety risk. Right? Those are two different things, and I'm going to go through a couple of examples here. So the first concept I want to introduce is that of cyber risk. And a very simple diagram here. The statement made is that you only have a cyber risk if you have a threat, a cyber adversary, cyber criminal, malware that is external. You have a vulnerability, a weakness in your system that can be exploited, and you have an asset of value. But only if you have those three, then you have an actual cyber risk. Or to express it in a more mathematical way, so risk is the combination of threat, vulnerability, and asset. Or in other words, if either the threat or the vulnerability or the asset is zero, then you don't have a risk. But if nobody is attacking you, then there is no risk. If you have a perfect system that has no weaknesses or vulnerabilities, then there is no risk. And if you have no assets to defend, then there's also no risk. And so that's a very important concept, and many times people overreact or underreact because they don't understand the combination and the dependency between those three concepts. And I'll send you the slides later so you have them. So I don't want to read through the definitions here. The one thing I want to point out, though, in terms of assets, assets can be anything that has value to an organization or value to an individual. That your patient data, if you work in a hospital, is an asset. Your vacation pictures are an asset to you personally. But also assets can be, I call it here soft, that can be the reputation of your hospital, that can be your patient's trust in their healthcare provider. Right, so don't have a limited view of assets as being workstations, servers, and data. It is also, the concept is further extended in things that can impact you and your reputation and your business indirectly. And then here, the definition of risk as the potential for an unwanted or adverse outcome that results from an incident. And again, you get the slides, so you can review and recap the definitions here. Another thing that you would come across is various approaches on how do you estimate cyber risks. And people have written entire books about that and have introduced very complex and different methodologies. The one I want to introduce here is probably the most commonly used, and it's also a very simple and easy to use one. And that is that you simply mathematically look at risk as having a probability of occurrence and a severity and impact on your organization, you as an individual, your information systems, whatever. And you just estimate risk as the mathematical product of probability and severity. You define probability as the likelihood of occurrence. But bear in mind, cybersecurity is not statistical. Right? If I have safety risk, traditional safety risk, for example, the risk of a battery failing in a pacemaker, the risk of a lead breaking on a patient monitoring device and losing signal from the patient, right? Those are things where you have statistical experience. How often does it happen in a given year across 1,000 patients, for example? And you can, based on that, fairly accurately predict the future. In cybersecurity, that is not the case. Typically, you have very little historic experience. Right? An attacker can decide to attack you at any time, can write a new malware that can compromise your systems at any time, and you go from 0 events in the past to being fully exposed and compromised today. Right? So in cybersecurity, we define probability more in the sense of exploitability. Right? So even if you haven't experienced an attack in the past, how easy would it be to attack your system? For example, does your attacker have to be physically close to the system, unscrew the backplane and connect to some service port in your system, or can your system be attacked via the public internet from another country? Right? How complex, how difficult is it to execute the attack? But if it's easy, then the exploitability is higher because any even unskilled hacker can execute it. What is the level of privilege you need to execute the attack? Do you have to be a system administrator, or can it be any user? Is there any user interaction required to execute the attack? Are there any known tools and techniques out there that could execute an attack? And are there any known exploits or actually attacks that have happened? Right. So you look at all those things, and there are probably a few more that you could add to it, and you try to predict how easy would it be to exploit my system, rather than asking the question, has it happened in the past? And then severity is obviously, in the context of medical devices, the impact on patient safety, but also the impact of care delivery, data privacy, and your larger business as a healthcare organization. And it includes considerations of the number of devices. So if you have only one MRI scanner, the severity of that MRI scanner being impacted is higher than, for example, if you have 3, one gets impacted, you still can continue with the other 2. That's an aspect of redundancy, but also you may have 1,000 infusion pumps or 100 infusion pumps. But that's a different risk scenario than if you have 1, 2, or 3 MRI scanners. Where's the device located? Right, your CT scanner that supports an emergency room and treats patients that get submitted with chest pain or signs of a stroke, that CT scanner is much more important to you than one that just supports radiology and orthopedics and broken bones and arthritis and cases like that. And then also, how good is your network? Right? How well is your network architected, and how well are you able to contain an attack if, for example, one device is attacked? How easily can the attack spread to other devices? So those are all considerations around severity. So back to estimating risk, right? So I assign a very simple scale here from improbable to probable to the probability or the exploitability, and I assign a scale of negligible to catastrophic to my severity. And then in this particular example, I use a 4x4 matrix in a simple multiplication of those 2 numbers to give me guidance on how significant the particular risk is of this particular device. Now, there are many other approaches. People use simpler matrices, more complex matrices. They use other formulas. For example, they may weight it rather than 1, 2, 3, 4. They may have a scale of 1, 2, 4, 8. Or they may use a different scale for severity than for probability. Again, entire books have been written about this. What is important is that we need to understand we're still estimating things here, right? Your input numbers are based on an estimation, hopefully an experienced estimation. But it doesn't make sense to calculate, for example, that a particular risk has a value of 3.278. But that doesn't make sense because, again, you only had a rough estimate of your probability and severity. So you really don't need to have a calculation that is more precise and has more granularity than the actual input value. And then also be prepared for change. Be prepared for regular updates. Things change, and they can change rapidly in cybersecurity. And also realize that this is a model, right? And models, unfortunately, have the ability to turn out different than reality. Right? So be prepared to adjust your model. Be prepared to update your calculations because, again, you're starting with a rough model that needs to be refined based on experience. Couple of other things here is, so once you've identified your risk, what do? Well, you control your risk and you start with the highest risks first, right? And you can do it by what is called mitigation, and those are preventive measures. Like a simple mitigation is, for example, a firewall or antivirus software on a computer, right? And with that, you reduce the probability, but also the severity of a cyber event. You can also implement contingency, which reduces pretty much the severity. What is contingency? Well, for example, you have backup devices. That is contingency. You have backup data. You have the ability to quickly restore devices. That is contingency. You can also transfer risk to another party, for example, through cyber insurance, and then hopefully through a methodological approach, you get to a level of risk acceptance, meaning that the likelihood or the probability and the impact or the severity are low enough that you can accept them. And typically, you do that in a repetitive fashion, that you implement your mitigations and your contingencies and reassess. You may find out, no, it's still not acceptable. So you mitigate more or add other mitigations to it until, again, you are at an acceptable level. And overall, the process of risk mitigation is considered the application of one or more measures to reduce the likelihood or probability of an unwanted occurrence and lessen the consequences. So that's risk reduction. And, a simple example here, obviously a little humorous, this is risk mitigation, right? The chain was broken and somebody fixed it. Is it very good risk mitigation? Probably not in this case, but at least it's a start. And then again, an iterative process, you finally go out and buy a new chain and address the problem in a more systemic way. And here's an example of risk transfer, right? You have a public area where there's maybe snakes and insects, and rather than facing lawsuits from visitors that get bitten, you just put up a sign and then you say, see, I warned you, so now it's your responsibility. Again, it's a little humorous example, but I want to kind of highlight the different aspects on how risk can be mitigated. Now I want to switch a little bit here and look more, take on more of a system view. We already introduced the concept of an asset, an asset being data or whatever data represents, for example, money. And that asset is typically protected within either an individual system, like a computer or a server in your data center, or even your larger enterprise, or your entire network, your firewalls and whatnot. And your assets are exposed to threats. They're external to your organization. And as long as your system is tight, the threats cannot compromise the asset. But in real life, we have vulnerabilities, like weaknesses in your systems. And typically we have not only just one, we have many, and we call that the attack surface. attack surface being all the ways that an attacker can compromise your system or your enterprise. And the threat that then successfully compromises a vulnerability is called an attack vector. Right? And they many times contain several steps of an attack, and that then leads to a security event. And once an attacker is inside of your system or enterprise and actually compromises an asset, that we call an incident. Now, this is a little bit of an academic distinction. Many times people don't differentiate between event and incident, and they use them interchangeably. But if you look again at the academic definition, an event is an indicator that an asset could be compromised, and the incident is then the actual compromise. We also have then external to your organization what is called the threat landscape, which are the adversaries, individual hackers or entire groups. They use what is called exploits, which are tools and methods. And we study those and do research on those. And we sum that up in what we call in the threat landscape and threat trends, like, for example, the statistics I showed you earlier on the number of new malwares per year. So we have a cyber hazard that is external to you, and you have cyber harm that is internal to you. And the big difference here is that you can control cyber harm, right? You can reduce vulnerabilities. You can protect your assets. You can identify and respond to events before they become incidents. But you have very little control over the external component, which is the cyber hazard. Maybe governments have, maybe law enforcement has, but you as an individual hospital typically have very little control over it. And that is a very important distinction. So the cyber harm is basically a reflection of risk, which is impact plus likelihood, or severity plus probability, statistical measures. As we discussed earlier, if you want to talk about cyber risk, it is probably better to either use a measure of exploitability or define that if you say probability in the context of cyber, that you mean exploitability. And people sometimes take that path as well. So what is actually cybersecurity? That is the preservation of confidentiality, integrity, and availability in cyberspace. Confidentiality meaning that only people that have the need to access information and the right to access information can access information. Integrity is that the information is not changed or altered. And availability is the property of you being able to access information when you need to. Those are traditional IT definitions. And especially when we talk about medical devices, we need to take a broader view, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail later. And here, not repeating, that cyber hazards are non-statistical. Therefore, likelihood as a pure statistical predictor based on past experience is not ideal. And therefore, we look at how easy would it be to exploit a particular vulnerability. We discussed that a moment ago. So now, cybersecurity challenges in healthcare, right? First question is, why is it actually so hard to protect healthcare organizations from cyber attacks? Right, enforcing cybersecurity compliance and cybersecurity in general actually may conflict with care delivery. Simple example here, an ambulance, I assume it's somewhere in the UK, parked in front of the hospital and got a boot on the front wheel by an eager policeman. So was that enforcing compliance? Yes, it was. Did that impact with care delivery? Yes, it did. But and that is the fine line in healthcare. Yeah, it would be good to have strong passwords, two-factor authentication for your doctors and nurses. But does that delay their access to systems And therefore, does that impact their ability to care for patients? Unfortunately, it does. And that is why many times security measures that are commonplace in other industries are very difficult to implement in healthcare. Also, healthcare organizations are very complex, both organizationally, but also from a technical perspective. And decision-making in healthcare is very complex. And both that organizational as well as the technical complexity, unfortunately, is an enemy of cybersecurity, where you want things to be simple and straightforward and easy. Technology platform decisions are driven by clinical needs, clinical preference, sometimes even vendor mandate. But if you buy a particular PACS system from GE or from Siemens or from Agfa, those vendors have very different mandates on what their network architecture, their data center should look like. And then there are also regulatory mandates, right? Mandates for patient care, mandates for patient safety that slow down change. And slowing down is never good in cybersecurity, where you want to be fast. Healthcare is conservative in decision making. That changed something as an industry. The history and the culture. Here in the US, we have what is called HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which defines certain privacy and security requirements. But complying with a regulation like HIPAA, and you have similar things in Europe, and I'm sure you have similar things in your country, is not necessarily security. But many times, hospitals invest in passing a government audit rather than trying to invest in security that can actually match a sophisticated cyber criminal or a sophisticated nation state attacker. And unfortunately, investing in compliance is not the same as investing in security. So healthcare has traditionally underinvested in security, lacked executive leadership in security, but what we've seen over the last few years is that that is finally changing and improving. Just to demonstrate, the condition of security in healthcare, here in the US, since 2009, healthcare organizations must report data breaches that affect more than 500 patients to Health and Human Services, which is our government's public health agencies, and they actually post the data, and you can actually download it and analyze it. And what we've seen over the last 10 years since we have this reporting mandate is that, first of all, the number of breaches pretty much has gone up every year except for 2015. We have seen an average 20% year-over-year increase, but that increase has accelerated 36% in 2019 and 28% in 2020. And 78% actually of the reported breaches were from healthcare providers. The other ones were from healthcare organizations like health insurance, for example, and other service providers. So in 2020, we saw 646 reported breaches affecting a total of 29 million patient records. Granted, here in the US, we have over 5,000 hospitals, and we have a population of 330 million, but still, those are still significant numbers. What is even more concerning is now that hacking/IT incidents is now the single largest reported cause of an incident. And in fact, if you look at the colors here in this chart, it is actually the only driver for increase since 2005. The second largest category is unauthorized access. And what used to be the largest back in the beginning of reporting, theft of, for example, laptops and external hard drives and things like that, is now down to a mere 6%. So clearly a very concerning shift to not only more attacks, but also more sophisticated and more aggressive criminal attacks. So if we look at the complexity, right, we need to look beyond confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But it is patient safety, it is care delivery. But if I shut down the CT scanner in my emergency room, I basically have to start diverting patient to another hospital. It is privacy, that's the confidentiality of data, but it's also security itself. And I have a little picture here of a fish tank as an example. There was a couple of years ago a casino in Las Vegas that was actually hacked into and had money, significant amounts of money, actually millions of dollars stolen. And they had, fish tank display in the lobby and in the casino and everywhere. And those fish tanks were remotely monitored by a company that specializes in these things. They monitored the temperature and the water, whatever chemistry. And the hackers actually were able to hack into this network of fish tanks and from there penetrate the financial network of the casino. And we've seen similar things in healthcare where medical devices were used as a bridgehead for an attack and compromise other things. And then, of course, there's your business and financial risk. And then lastly, there's indirect risks, things like patient trust, but also patient treatment decisions. If, for example, patients are worried about the cybersecurity of their pacemaker, they may reject a medically very sensitive treatment decision out of undue cybersecurity fears. So now finally we get to the topic of medical device security. So we live in very challenging times from the medical device perspective. Right? The ecosystem of medical devices is very complex. Many different types of devices running different operating systems from different manufacturers need to be protected. But also, they live quite long. 5, 10, 15 years is normal for many medical devices. So we have a significant legacy burden and a significant security debt because of devices that were designed in a time where security threats were much simpler than what we are facing today. The adversaries are changing. We talked about the threat landscape. We talked about changing skill, changing motivation, and the medical devices are now exposed to that. But we also see societal changes. That the awareness of medical device security, the recognition of the problem is now much broader. It goes beyond just, let's say, us as the specialists in the field. Regulators are paying attention and they're implementing now regulations for more secure devices, but also the press is paying attention, patients are paying attention, the general public is paying attention. And we also need to understand that care delivery is changing. We are actually starting, and COVID has accelerated that, to move more and more patients into their homes to at least provide simple medical services in the patient's home rather than in the hospital, which is cheaper, but also creates a whole slew of new cybersecurity problems. So with that, the risk of a targeted attack, the risk of collateral damage, the risk of compromise of integrity and availability, but also privacy and confidentiality of data in medical devices and transmitted by medical devices is going up. And so there are multiple things happening at the same time we need to deal with and we need to address in order to properly address cybersecurity risks for medical devices. Briefly diving in here on that aspect of coincidental attacks, right? I call it often collateral damage, meaning the device was not targeted, but it fit the profile of the attack. But you may run an operating system that fits the profile of a certain malware. You may have certain network connections that an attacker is specialized in exploiting, and they may not even realize that they're attacking the medical devices. This type of attack is most common with devices that run commercial operating systems of the Windows and Linux flavors, but also other commercial off-the-shelf software like databases and browsers and Adobe software and so forth. And again, the attacker may not realize that they have compromised a medical device, and they may not realize that they're jeopardizing care delivery and patient safety. And these type of devices are susceptible to all types of malware, including ransomware, but they may also be used as an entry point and a hiding point for an attack. Now, we also have the much more concerning scenario of a targeted attack with the intent to do harm. Right? And we know from security research that that is possible, but we don't have any documented cases that this has happened. But then at the same time, we also need to recognize how would we know, but do we actually have enough data collected and the right sensors on our networks to determine whether a medical device shutdown that led to a patient safety incident was actually due to a targeted attack. But it is certainly possible, and we know that as attackers become more aggressive and look for new ways to make money, that certainly a blackmail or ransoming scenario with the goal to extort money from a hospital or medical device manufacturer is in the realm of the possible. But it could also be theft of intellectual property, medical device software, or clinical trials that are being conducted with medical devices. It could also be politically motivated. The harm of a nation to care for their patients and to destroy the trust in the health system could be a political motivator. And then certainly there could be theft of credentials, usernames, passwords, or even insurance IDs as a targeted attack. So as I said, what we're seeing on the left today is the more common scenario, but has less severe impact, and we can deal with it more, not completely, but more along the line of a traditional IT incident. What we're seeing on the right, we know from security research it is possible and would be much more severe, but we don't have any documented cases yet. What we also need to consider when we perform, for example, a risk assessment or think about cyber risks in general, that we have different types of systems in our hospital. We have medical devices. We have other operational technology like your air conditioning, your elevators, your security systems. You have clinical IT systems like your electronic record system, your PACS, your lab. You have administrative IT systems like your email, your billing system, your scheduling system, you name it. And they all have different types of risks. And what we need to recognize is with medical devices, we probably have the most complex risk scenarios we need to consider and protect against, followed by clinical IT. But we also shouldn't overlook the other types we have. For example, if an attacker shuts down a hospital's air conditioning or shuts down a hospital's elevator and brings patient transportation to a halt, you impact care delivery, right? So those scenarios should be considered and should be prepared for. Briefly talking about now how you address that, right? So one is obviously asset management, right? You need to know what you have, what is on your network, and how it is configured, and what the IT properties are of those devices on your network. That is very common practice in the IT space with your workstations and your servers and your databases and whatnot. And it's only now becoming a practice, and we're only establishing the right tools nowadays on the medical device side. We also need to include security requirements in the procurement process in our contracts with the medical device vendors, right? And that is not only technical security requirements, but also the procedural ones, the vendor's obligations to, for example, provide security updates and patches, the vendor's obligation to help us in case of a security incident and we need to respond. And those two are obviously closely related, they're not independent. Then we need to perform our risk analysis based on the data we collect, evaluate the risk, whether it is acceptable. Those two together are typically considered and called risk assessment or risk assessment process. That then leads to risk mitigation. We talked about that earlier. Risk mitigation can happen on the device, which typically then lies with the manufacturer, or can happen external to the device, which is on your network, but also device handling and who's allowed to use it and whatnot. And that then leads to a continual risk management process. The last two are tightly related to your overall device lifecycle management process, but your onboarding, your device end of life process where you discard a device and remove all critical data from the device. Your upgrades, your patching, your change management, your dependency management, and so forth. And also they're closely related to your incident response, your detection, your recovery from an incident, your investigation in an incident. And there should always be a lessons learned, as in, why did this incident happen? Why was the device not prepared for it, was vulnerable to it? And why did I not predict it in my risk analysis? And so there's a circular approach here that every time something happens, you learn and you improve. Now wrapping up here, a couple of real world examples. Right? This is an example of security getting in the way of patient care. Right? So somebody in IT, some IT systems, a system scanned the network, some tool, and detected a Windows computer and decided to push an update, not realizing that this Windows computer was actually a medical device in the midst of a procedure. And so those are examples on how traditional IT security can impact medical device and medical devices and their ability to deliver care. Here an example from security research, where security researchers were actually able to manipulate CT images to add actually lung tumors or remove existing tumors from images and then show those images to radiologists. And pretty much in 90% of cases, they were not able to detect the manipulation of an image. Again, that's an example from research, but it shows how sinister and how complex these kind of attacks can be that involve medical devices and medical device data. Here's an example of a hospital in Russia where in the midst of a brain surgical procedure, all systems went down due to a ransomware attack. Now, the good news is the patient did well. The surgeons were able to complete the surgery without support of the systems, both IT systems and medical devices, but it was a close call, right? It was a severe cyber incident. Another type is, this is a hospital here in the US, where a device was stolen from a hospital, an ultrasound scanner with patient data on it, and it was classified as a data breach. And then lastly, an example, research by a security company, they were able to demonstrate that medical devices were recognized by one particular cyber criminal group as a weak spot, and they were actually targeting across multiple hospitals medical devices as an entry point to attack other systems, but the medical device was the weak spot, was the bridgehead, and the hiding point for an attack. So with that, wrapping up here, a couple of resources. A friend of mine, Steve Grimes, and I, we co-edited a book on the topic of medical device security from the healthcare provider, meaning hospital perspective. And we got many organizations to contribute, everything from articles and chapters to procedures and best practices. So this could be a valuable resource for people in your profession and for people working in hospital being concerned about medical device cybersecurity. And disclaimer here, I do not financially benefit from the sale of the book. AAMI is a medical device industry organization here in the US, but also internationally. And we wrote the book for AAMI, but again, there's no financial compensation through the sale of the book. So I think, without conflict of interest, promote it freely. And then here, I'm not going to go through a number of useful resources, and there are many more, but I think those are probably some you will find useful as you educate yourself more on cybersecurity in general and medical device security in specific. And with that, wrapping up, and I'm open for questions.